the hint of a revolutionary change in U.S.-Cuban relations and the possible thawing of the Cold War between Cuba and the United States that has gone on for more than 20 years after the end of the rest of the Cold War. And I'll loop back to that a little bit at the very end, but obviously the events that I'm going to discuss here have a lot to do with those recent events. So let me get into character for a moment. My fellow Americans, it is with a heavy heart and in fulfillment of my oath of office that I have ordered, and the United States Air Force has now carried out military operations to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup on the island of Cuba. More like Cuba. This action has been taken under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations and in fulfillment of requirements of national safety. Further military action has been authorized to ensure that this threat is fully removed and not restored. But I want to make clear, we have no quarrel with the Cuban people. Their lives and land being used as pawns by those who deny them freedom. We have no wish to make war on them. Our objective is to give them back the dream of their revolution, their dream which Fidel Castro betrayed when he sold them out to the communists. Our objective in the world is peace and freedom, including the peace and freedom of the Cuban people. That speech I found in the National Security Archive in George Washington University, which is a bizarre and fascinating treasure trove of unearthed declassified secrets from U.S. foreign policy. It was drafted on October 18, 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You probably guessed, though, or maybe hopefully you guessed at this point, that Kennedy never delivered this speech. In fact, it begins with him describing why he's carried out military actions against Cuba. He had drafted it to explain that. If he had delivered this speech, if he had indeed delivered it, if he had indeed ordered those military actions on Cuba, the world would look very different than it does now. We all might not be here. So the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've been learning about days that shook the world. This one indeed shook the world. And I do apologize for jumping out of order a little bit, but hopefully this will all connect for you by the end of the semester. This was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, closest humanity ever came to virtual extinction. And it's not surprising that the Cuban Missile Crisis has gotten a lot of attention from people, from commentators, from historians, from journalists at the time and afterwards, from participants who wanted to write their memoirs and explain their side of it. And almost all of them deal with questions I don't know if you've actually broached yet. Context and contingency. I was going to. Yes?
The words come up, yeah.
Okay. If you want to sort of boil them down or distill these questions into really two words, two terms, you can do this, and it really is a useful, I think, exercise for historical thinking. Context being one, and contingency being the other. And these are two questions that historians circle back to constantly. Now, the first is certainly important, context, and I'm going to delve into this. And context meaning, okay, this is the event, but what were the circumstances surrounding it? What were the historical events that led to it? How did the crisis arise? What did it mean in the big picture? And the first half of this lecture really is about that context. And I'm emphasizing, this is a huge topic, people spend their whole careers on it, but I'm emphasizing a couple of clear sort of themes of context. The nuclear arms race, for one. Cold War competition is wrapped up in that, but not limited to nuclear arms. And the Cuban Revolution, which was part of a wave of third world revolutions and radical nationalism in the 50s and 60s. And that revolution and the U.S. clashed with it that really provided the stage, opened the stage, set the stage for this crisis. So that's really the context to understand. And I think I've got it, hopefully, my very basic outline here for you to follow. The second half is really going to emphasize contingency, and when I talk about this, I'm especially going to be referring to the sort of the interaction and the confrontation between the United States and Cuba and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Revolution. Contingency. Why did the crisis go the way it did? Well, first of all, why did the U.S. clash with the revolution, and why things have gone differently? And this is always the question that historians are often, on some level, reluctant to ask, sort of counterfactuals. Could it have gone differently? And historians often two things they get very uncomfortable about: predicting the future and thinking about what might have happened if some other decision or another set of circumstances had occurred. But of course, this is important to understand because you can't understand the importance of decisions made by policymakers, particular events, if you don't understand how things might have gone differently. Contingency. Why did this conversation arise? Why did the crisis go the way it did? What might have happened, in fact, if certain decisions or events had gone differently? Is that all clear? Context, contingency? We roll on?
So we often talk about context in terms of structure.
Okay.
So larger structures that are in play, and then contingency, of course, related to the idea of agency. People have options.
So, nuclear weapons, Cold War competition. I know I'm leaping ahead a little bit, but hopefully not spoiling any events that you don't already know about. The U.S. decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945, which effectively ended World War II in the Pacific, added a new element to tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that had actually been around for a long time. The ideological conflict between Soviet states that had emerged from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, I should say, but after World War II, this created a communist state. And of course, this was a model that the United States and many Western nations were not familiar with, not comfortable with, not clear how they should view it, how they should interact with it. But the important part was, through the 1920s, 1930s, the Soviet state was weak. It may have been an ideological challenge, but it wasn't a strategic, it certainly wasn't a geostrategic threat to the United States or to Western Europe. World War II changed this. First by drawing the United States and the Soviet Union into an alliance against Hitler, and then, in the wake of the war, by leaving a power vacuum in Europe. You've got the great powers in Western Europe, decimated, weakened power vacuum into which both these new rising powers are trying to step. They're trying to project their ideas for the shape of not just Europe, but the world. So by the end of World War II, the reality was that the U.S. and Soviet leaders and their people had come to see their two competing systems as not just contradictory in intention, but literally competing for the future of the world. Which model was going to be the model for the world's future? So you have this long-standing ideological clash. Now you have a strategic competition between these two powers. And then into that you add the unpredictable and unprecedented ingredient of nuclear weapons. So there's been Cold War clashes, there's been great power competition before, there's been ideological tension certainly before, but never this combination along with the destructive power, the new destructive power of the atomic bomb and the subsequent different nuclear weapons that were developed. At first, Washington enjoyed a monopoly. In fact, throughout the early Cold War years, the late 40s to early 50s, the U.S. held the upper hand in both economic and destructive power. But in the fall of 1949, there were two shocking setbacks for Americans, for U.S. policymakers and the public. The first one, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic device. This is all really in the fall of 49. And the second one, when communist forces took control of China. And there was a feeling then of the Cold War turning a little bit, the momentum of the Cold War turning against the United States. This is not a coincidence that this is the period where you see the emergence of real Cold War paranoia associated with McCarthyism, fear that somehow the United States is not just falling behind, maybe they're communist elements in U.S. society that are weakening it. The next year, 1950, fear of World War III became very real when the United States entered the Korean War between North and South Korea, and in response to that, Chinese troops intervened, and there were discussions for the first time of the actual possibility of using dropping atomic weapons on communist power. In this case, there were U.S. generals demanding to drop atomic weapons on China, Chinese forces. Throughout the 1950s, early to mid-50s, the Soviet Union was desperate to catch up to the U.S. militarily, and especially in terms of nuclear arms. And certainly by the mid-50s, if not earlier, it was clear that there's a full-blown nuclear arms race on, and public fears are rising. Now, I have a little film for you. They call it in YouTube propaganda film, but really it's an instructional video. I'm really hoping you guys can hear this. I'm a little nervous that it might not work.